Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. The Precession of Simulacra. Simulacra is never what hides the truth. It is the truth that hides the fact that there is none. Ecclesiastes. If once we are able to view the Borgia's fable in which the cartographers of the empire draw up a map so detailed that it ends up covering the territory exactly, the decline of the empire witnessing the fraying of this map little by little, and its fall into ruins, through some shreds, are still discernible in the deserts, the metaphysical beauty of this ruined abstraction, testifying to a pride equal to the empire, and rotting like a carcass, returning to the substance of the soil, a bit as the double ends, by being confused with the real through aging. As the most beautiful allegory of simulation, this fable has now come full circle for us, and processes nothing but the discreet charm of second-order simulacra. Note 1. Today, abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, precession of simulacra, that engenders the territory. And if one must return to the fable, today is a territory whose shreds slowly rot across the extent of the map. It is the real, and not the map, whose vestiges persist here, and there is the desert that no longer those of the empire but ours. The desert of the real itself. In fact, we are inverted. Borgia's fable is unusable. Only the allegory of the empire, perhaps, remains. Because it is within the same imperialism that the present-day simulators attempt to make the real, all of the real, coincident with the models of simulation. But it is no longer a question of either maps or territories. Something has disappeared, the sovereign difference between one and the other, that instituted the charm of abstraction, because it is difference that constitutes the poetry of the map, and the charm of territory. The magic of the concept, and the charm of the real. This imaginary of representation, which simultaneously culminates in and is engulfed by the cartographer's mad project of that ideal coextensivity of map and territory, disappears in the simulation whose operation is nuclear and genetic, no longer at all specular or discursive. It is all of metaphysics that is lost. No more mirror or being and appearances of the real and its concept. No more imaginary coextensivity. It is genetic miniaturization that is the dimension of simulation. The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, memory banks, models of control, and it can be produced an indefinite number of times from these. It no longer needs to be rational, because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational. In fact, it is no longer really the real, because no imaginary envelopes it anymore. It is a hyperreal, produced from a radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere. By crossing into a space whose curvature is no longer that of the real, nor that of truth, the era of simulation is inaugurated by a liquidation of all referentials, worse, with their artificial resurrection. In the system of signs, a material more malleable than meaning, in that it lends itself to all systems of equivalences, to all binary oppositions, to all combinatory algebra. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parity. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. That is to say, of an operation of deterring every real process via its operational double, a pragmatic, metastable, perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short-circuits all its vicissitudes. Never again will the real have the chance to produce itself. Such is the vital function of the model in a system of death, or rather, of anticipated resurrection, that no longer gives the event of death a chance, a hyperreal, henceforth sheltered from the imaginary, and from any distinction between the real and the imaginary, leaving room only for the orbital recurrence of models, and for the simulated generation of differences. The divine a reference of images. To dissimulate is to pretend not to have what one has. To simulate is to feign to have what one doesn't have. One implies the presence, the other one an absence. But it is more complicated than that. Being simulating is not pretending. Whoever takes an illness can simply stay in bed and make everyone believe he is ill. Whoever simulates an illness produces in himself some of the symptoms, therefore pretending, or dissimulating, leaves the principle of reality intact. The difference is always clear. It is simply masked. Whereas simulation threatens the difference between the quote true and the quote false, the quote real and the quote imaginary. Is the simulator sick or not? Given that he produces quote true symptoms, objectively, one cannot treat him as being either ill or not ill. Psychology and medicine stops at this point, forestalled by the illness's henceforth undiscoverable truth. For if any symptom could be produced, and can no longer be taken as a fact of nature, then every illness can be considered as simulatable and simulated. And medicine loses its meaning, since it only knows how to treat, quote, real illnesses, according to their objective causes. Psychosomatics evolves in a dubious manner, as the borders of the principle of illness. As a psychoanalysis, it transfers the symptoms of the organic order to the unconscious order. The latter is new and taken for, quote, real. More real than the other. Why would simulation be at the gates of the unconscious? Why would the, quote, work of the unconscious be, quote, produced in the same way as any old symptom of classical medicine? Dreams already are. Certainly, the psychiatrist purports that, quote, for every form of mental alienation, there is a particular order in the succession of symptoms of which the simulator is ignorant, and in the absence of which the psychiatrist would not be deceived, end quote. This, which dates from 1865, in order to safeguard the principle of truth at all costs, and to escape the interrogation posed by simulation. The knowledge that truth, reference, objective cause, have ceased to exist. Now, what can medicine do with what floats on either side of illness, on either side of health, with the duplication of illness in a discourse that no longer either true or false? What can psychoanalysis do with the duplication of the discourse of the unconscious in the discourse of simulation that can never again be unmasked, since it is not false either? Note number 2. What can the army do about simulators? Traditionally, it unmasks them and punishes them, according to a clear principle of identification. Today, it can discharge a very good simulator, as exactly equivalent to a, quote, real homosexual, a heart patient, or a madman. Even military psychology draws back at the courtesan certainties, and hesitates to make the distinction between true and false, between the, quote, produced and the authentic symptom. Quote, if he is this good at acting crazy, it's because he is, end quote. Nor is military psychology mistaken in this regard. In this sense, All crazy people simulate, and this lack of distinction is the worst kind of subversion. It is against this lack of distinction that classical reason armed itself in all its categories, but it is what today again outflanks them, submerging the principle of truth. Beyond medicine, the army favored terrains of simulation. The question returns to religion and the simulacrum of divinity. Quote, I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented. End quote. Indeed, it can be. But what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons? When it is manipulated in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme power that is simply incarnated in images as a visible theology, or does it violate itself in the simulacra that alone deploy their power and pomp of fascination, the visible machinery of icons substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God? This is precisely what was feared by iconoclasts, whose millennia quarrel is still with us today. Note number 3. This is precisely because they predicted this omnipotence of simulacra, the faculty simulacra have of effacing God from the conscience of man, and the destructive, annihilating truth that they allow to appear, that deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum ever existed. Even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum. From this came this urge to destroy the images. If they could have believed that these images only obfuscated or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reason to destroy them. One can live with the idea of distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came to the idea that the image didn't conceal anything at all, and that these images were in essence not images, such as an original model have made them, but perfect simulacra, forever radiant with their own fascination. Thus, this death of the divine referential must be exercised at all costs. One can see the iconoclasts, whom one accuses of disdaining and negating images, were those who accorded them their true value, in contrast to the iconolators, who only saw reflections in them and were content to venerate a filigree god. On the other hand, one can say that the icon worshippers were the most modern minds, the most adventurous because, in the guise of having God become apparent in the mirror of images, they were already enacting his death and his disappearance in the epiphany of his representations, which perhaps they already knew no longer represented anything, that they were purely a game. But that it was therein the great game lay, knowing also that it is dangerous to unmask images, since they dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them. This was the approach of Jesuits, who founded their politics on the virtual disappearance of God, and on the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciences. The evanescence of God in the epiphany of power, the end of transcendence, which now only serves as an alibi for a strategy altogether free of influences and signs. Behind the baroqueness of images hides the eminence, grace of politics. This way, the stake will always have been the murderous power of images, murderers of the real, murderers of their own model, as the Byzantine icons could be those of divine identity. To this murderous power is opposed that of representations as a dialectical power, the visible and intelligible mediation of the real. All Western faith and good faith became engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could be exchanged for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange, God, of course. But what if God himself can be simulated? That is to say, can be reduced to the sign that constitutes faith? Then the whole system becomes weightless. It is no longer itself anything but a gigantic simulacrum, not unreal, but a simulacrum, that is to say, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself, in an uninterrupted circuit without reference of circumference. Such is simulation, in so far as it is opposed to representation. Representations stem from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and of the real, even if the equivalence is utopian. It is a fundamental axiom. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the utopia of principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the sign as value, from the sign as the reverse and death sentence of every reference, whereas representation attempts to observe simulation by interpreting it as a false representation. Simulating envelops the whole edifice of representation itself as a simulacrum. Such would be the successive phase of the image. It is the reflection of a profound reality. It masks and denatures a profound reality. It masks the absence of a profound reality. It has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. In the first case, the image is a good appearance. A representation is of a sacramental order. In the second, it is an evil appearance. It is the order of maleficence. In the third, it plays at being an appearance. It is the order of sorcery. In the fourth, it is no longer of the order of appearances, but of simulation. The transition from the signs that dissimulate something to signs that dissimulates that there is nothing marks a decisive turning point. The first reflects a theology of truth and secrecy, to which the notion of ideology still belongs. The second inaugurates the era of simulacra and of simulation, in which there is no longer a God to recognize his own, no longer a last judgment to separate the false from the true, the real from its artificial resurrection, as everything is already dead and resurrected in advance. When the real is no longer what it was, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a plethora of myths of origin and of signs of reality, a plethora of truth, of secondary objectivity and authenticity, escalation of the true, of lived experience, resurrection of the figurative, where the object and substance have disappeared, panic-stricken production of the real and of the referential, parallel to and greater than the panic of material production. This is how simulation appears in the phase that concerns us, a strategy of the real, of the neo-real, and the hyper-real, that everywhere is a double of a strategy of deterrence.